Hey there, I'm Apple Credit from Investing Simple. In today's video, we're providing an in-depth look at the question of how do fractional shares work on Robinhood versus M1 Finance, because both of these platforms do offer fractional shares to their investors. However, the ways in which they do so do differ between the two platforms. So we're going to compare and contrast the fractional shares on both so that you can see what the differences are and then hopefully make a better decision for yourself on which platform makes the most sense for you to use. So without further ado, let's dive right on into it. Now, the first question that we need to address is what is a fractional share? So a fractional share is exactly what it sounds like. It is a fraction of a share of a company, otherwise known as a stock. So in the past, if I wanted to invest in Amazon stock, I would have to fork over $3,000 just to buy a single share. When I got started investing, fractional shares weren't actually a thing, and so I had to buy full shares of stock like Amazon and Google for thousands of dollars a pop. But now that fractional shares are more popular, apps like Robinhood and M1 Finance are offering them, you can buy a fraction of that Amazon share. So instead of forking over $3,000, you can fork over $10, $20, $100 to buy just a portion of that share instead of having to buy the entire thing all at once. This has made it a lot more accessible for smaller investors to get involved with these bigger companies and to also build diversified portfolios with not as much capital, which is a super good thing, especially with the rise of interest in investing among younger people that don't tend to have as much money to put into their investments. But at the same time, there are some risks that come along with owning fractional shares, same as the risks that are included with any kinds of stocks that you're purchasing. So one thing to keep in mind here is that just because you're buying a fraction of a share doesn't mean you're taking on a fraction of the risk. So for example, say I wanted to buy $100 worth of Amazon stock. So I'm buying only a couple percentage points of a full share of Amazon. But if Amazon stock goes down 10%, my $100 of Amazon is also going to go down 10%. So just know that just because you have a fraction of the share does not mean you only experience a fraction of the losses. You get to experience the full losses as well as the full gains when you do own fractional shares of stock. However, if you do use fractional shares to become more diversified, that is a potential way that you could reduce your risk through owning fractional shares. So say you had $3,000 to invest, you could either buy one share of Amazon or you could split that $3,000 up among a couple dozen companies. That would be a good way to use fractional shares to potentially decrease your risk as opposed to just putting it all into Amazon stock, because then you are fully tied to the share price of Amazon, whether it goes up or down. But now let's get into these platforms in particular. So starting off with M1 Finance. The M1 Finance fractional shares work like this. So they allow you to buy 1/10,000th of a share, which is pretty wild. Okay, so to give you some context, Berkshire Hathaway is a stock that trades over $300,000 per share. So you could get exposure to that $300,000 share of stock for as little as $30, which is pretty nice for beginner investors out there that want to participate in larger companies like this. At the same time, it also allows you to diversify on a much cheaper basis. So for example, say you wanted to make Amazon stock 10% of your portfolio. In the past, you've got a $3,000 share of Amazon that you have to buy, and to make that 10% of your portfolio, you need a $30,000 portfolio. But on M1 Finance, say you want to buy Amazon stock, you want to make it 10% of your portfolio, you've only got $100. You can absolutely do that because you can just buy $10 worth of Amazon stock. So it allows you to build that diversified portfolio for a much cheaper price than you would have to do if you're buying individual shares. Now on M1 Finance with their fractional shares, we're looking at a minimum transaction amount of $1. So you have to buy in at least $1 increments. You cannot go lower than that. And that saves them on transactional costs as well as saving you on transactional costs and just the headache of having more tax documents to go through. When they can simplify it and make it just $1 for the minimum, it simplifies things for everyone. Now you're going to have two main ways to get fractional shares on the M1 Finance platform. The first of which is when you allocate money into your investment pie. That's how investments work on M1 Finance. Then it's going to be diverted into the appropriate companies on a percentage basis based on how you built that pie. So for some context here on M1 Finance, basically what you do is you build this pie. You say, I want 10% of my investment to go to Amazon, 30% to Google, 20% to the S&P 500. And so it just allocates it for you and buys fractional shares to meet that allocation. The other way to get fractional shares on M1 Finance is through their dividend reinvestment plan. And we have a whole video going over dividends on M1 Finance. You can check that out up here. But just know that that is another way that you can get fractional shares is when your dividends are reinvested for you, M1 Finance will use those to buy fractional shares on your behalf. Now, many investors on M1 Finance are also wondering, how do voting rights work and how do dividends work if you own fractional shares? Because you want to still be able to collect your dividends if you own dividend stocks. You also still want to be able to vote in company decisions because you have ownership in that particular company. And how it works is exactly how you would expect. Okay, you get a fractional share of your voting rights and a fractional share of the dividends based on how many stocks you own. So if you own half of a share of Apple, Apple pays a dividend, you get half of that dividend, and the person who owns the other half of that Apple gets the other half of the dividends. Same thing with the voting rights, so that is pretty straightforward. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind with M1 Finance fractional shares, you cannot transfer these out. So if you do decide at some point you want to move your M1 Finance brokerage to another brokerage, you cannot transfer the fractional shares. The fractional shares will be sold and the cash will be moved to that new account. This is pretty standard across brokerages. It's not very easy to move fractional shares from one broker to another. So in most cases, what's going to happen is those fractional shares will be sold and the cash will then be moved to the new account. So say, for example, you own 3.5 shares of Amazon, that half share will be sold, the other 3 shares will be moved, and the cash that you get from selling that will also be moved. So now that you've got an understanding of how M1 Finance fractional shares work, let's move to Robinhood and give you the full scoop on Robinhood fractional shares and how they compare and contrast. So unlike M1 Finance, on Robinhood, you can actually buy as little as 1/1,000,000th of a share. So M1 Finance is 1/10,000. Robinhood took it a step further, as they do, and it is 1/1,000,000th of a share. So coming back to that Berkshire Hathaway stock example at $300,000, on Robinhood, you could buy exposure to that company for as little as 30 cents, okay? So it's getting pretty ridiculous as far as how fractional these shares are actually getting. Now, you're also gonna be looking at a minimum transaction of $1 at a time on the Robinhood platform. Again, like I said, this is for simplicity's sake on their end and on your end, because if there are transactions going through all the time with just pennies at a time, it just makes things more complicated for everyone. Now, there's also 2 ways to get fractional shares on Robinhood. The first of which is by buying them. So on Robinhood, when you want to purchase a stock, you get to decide if you want to buy it in terms of shares or dollars. So you could say, I want to buy 1 share of Apple stock, or you could say, I want to buy $100 worth of Apple stock. If you say you want to buy it in dollars, then they're going to buy fractional shares for you to meet that amount that you want to invest. The second way to get fractional shares on Robinhood is one of the same ways as you get them on M1 Finance, and that is through their dividend reinvestment plan. So Robinhood also offers one of these things, works a little bit different to how M1 Finance's works, but you'll be able to reinvest your dividends in more shares of that stock, specifically fractional shares of the stock that paid that particular dividend to you. Now, a couple limitations to keep in mind with fractional shares on Robinhood. The first of which is when you buy them through the platform, say you want to buy $100 worth of Apple stock, you can only use a good till close market order. What this essentially means is that this order will automatically close if it is not fulfilled within the day, and it has to be a market order. So you cannot use a limit order or any other type of order in order to buy fractional shares on Robinhood. You have to use a normal market order that is only good until the end of the trading day. Other thing to keep in mind is that Robinhood only allows fractional shares on companies that have a market cap of over $25 million, which in the grand scheme of things is not that large. So you're looking at very small companies once you have below a $25 million market cap. But just know that if that company does not have that high of a market cap, you probably aren't going to be able to trade fractional shares on the Robinhood platform. Now, when it comes to the question of voting rights and dividends with Robinhood fractional shares, they work the exact same way as they do on M1 Finance. You're getting your proportional share of the voting rights, your proportional share of the dividend to your particular account. You don't really have to worry about that. And then lastly, when it comes to transferring your fractional shares out of Robinhood, same rules apply as with M1 Finance. You're not going to be able to transfer those out. They're going to be sold, and then the proceeds are going to be moved. So you can only move full shares between these different types of accounts. You cannot move the fractional shares. So overall, when you're comparing the fractional shares offered on Robinhood to the fractional shares offered on M1 Finance, they have a lot more similarities than they have difference. The main places where they differ is in how granular you can get with your particular fractional shares. So Robinhood comes out on top here with being able to go down to the millionth of a share, whereas with M1 Finance, it is 1/10,000th of a share. And then also just how the platforms are structured as a whole. So like I mentioned, M1 Finance has that pie structure that you've got to follow, whereas with Robinhood, it's more of just a buying and selling individual stocks as you go. There's a lot less guardrails for you on the Robinhood platform than there are on M1 Finance, because M1 Finance kind of forces you to be a longer term investor. Now, if you want to learn more about fractional shares on M1 Finance or on Robinhood, we have full comprehensive guides for both of those over on our website, investingsimple.com. So the best way to find those is to head on over to Google and search for either M1 Finance fractional shares or Robinhood fractional shares and click on the link for investingsimple.com. We will see you over there.